Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to today's Council on Foreign Relations Symposium, The Middle East, Cold War and Emerging Technologies, the Contributions of Henry Kissinger. This session is titled Emerging Technologies from the Nuclear Age to AI. I'm Joan Rolfing, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and I will be presiding today over today's discussion. So let me introduce the speakers. First of all, with me here, Sam Sachs, Senior Fellow of the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School, and Senior Fellow, Future Security at New America. Also on Zoom, we have Dr. Graham Allison, the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a CFR member. And Dr. Neil Ferguson, Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and the author of Kissinger, the Idealist, covering the years 1923 to 1968. It's wonderful to see both of you, if virtually. So I want to start this morning by talking a little bit about Dr. Kissinger and his work in the emerging technology space. In his lifetime, Dr. Kissinger experienced several technological revolutions, two of which, nuclear and AI, pose potentially existential risks to humanity. His life's work included important work regarding the implications of these technologies for US and global security. We want to probe his thinking today, his framing of existential risks in emerging technology, and I would say AI in particular. What lessons should we take from Dr. Kissinger's work in the nuclear domain that have relevance and applicability to managing the increasingly complex challenge of AI and emerging tech? What were his recommendations regarding how to safeguard AI? Let me say a word too about definitions. Many of us are increasingly using artificial intelligence, that term, to kind of connote a very broad range of emerging technologies, in part because AI intersects with so many other emerging technologies. So today, when I say AI, I use that in a very inclusive way. I think AI in and of itself is a worthy discussion for, frankly, a multi-day symposium. But when I say AI today, I don't want our speakers to limit their thinking narrowly to artificial intelligence, but also to share their thoughts about how it intersects with other enabling capabilities of AI and other technologies. So I'll also note that three of the four of us on stage had personal relationships with Dr. Kissinger, in some case over, I think in all cases, probably over a multi-decadal period. So it's a privilege and an honor to be able to engage this discussion today. So I want to start our session with a very short lightning round, same question to each of our three panelists about AI. And I'll start by observing over the last year, we've seen a lot of change in the AI space. This has suddenly kind of come into focus for many people who've heard about AI for a long time, but who haven't had any kind of direct engagement with it. But over the past year and couple of months alone, we've seen the public release of ChatGPT. A lot of us have interacted with that. That gives us kind of a palpable feel for the technology. We've seen the publication of an open letter organized by the Center for AI Safety that urged mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. And we continue to see a wide-ranging debate between camps that believe that AI should be allowed to develop without constraints To those that believe the work on AI should be terminated until such time as we have a plan in place to prevent an extinction event. So we've got kind of both sides of that spectrum. I'm curious where our panelists are in their thinking about this technology. Sam, I'm going to start with you here on stage. Do you believe, and so lightning round, I'm just looking for a sentence from each of you. Do you believe AI poses an existential threat to humanity?
No, if we don't let it.
Okay. Graham, let's go to you next.
I would say no one knows. There's been a genre of fiction that is essentially dystopian about the ways in which ultimately AI either subordinates human beings or eliminates them. But I'm a congenital optimist, so I would say it's conceivable, but no one knows. It's certainly enough to worry about, but again, no one knows, and I'm ultimately optimistic.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm going to be looking for signs of optimism in this discussion today. There are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. Neil, same question to you. Is AI an existential threat?
Probably not, but AGI probably would be, and that's a really important distinction. If Sam Altman is successful, he only needs $7 trillion to create artificial general intelligence. We'll have created aliens in our own midst that are more intelligent than us. And if you ask the other species on this planet that are less intelligent than us how it's gone for them, I think you'll get a pretty gloomy verdict. So I'm of the view that AGI is the thing we need to worry about, not AI itself.
Thank you. All right, that's a good scene setter. Let's dig into some of that. And Graham, I want to give the first kind of main or larger question to you. In October last year, so really just the month before Dr. Kissinger passed away, you co-authored a piece with Dr. Kissinger entitled The Path to AI Arms Control. America and China must work together to avert catastrophe. Your article acknowledged the extraordinary challenges associated with safeguarding the awesome potential of AI, and then draws from lessons learned in the nuclear era to inform how humanity might approach the management of AI. So both you and Dr. Kissinger urged engagement with China at both track 1 and the track 2 level. And you also observed that there's a narrow window of opportunity right now, given how quickly this technology is moving to influence the space. I'm curious, Graham, why do you think we should be optimistic that this kind of government-to-government engagement is a viable path forward, given the strong competition between the US and China, the dysfunction, frankly, in our own government right now, and the fact that AI innovation is largely, in fact, almost exclusively in the hands of the private sector. Can you give us some reasons for optimism on this approach?
Well, you certainly framed the issue well. And it's an interesting, I appreciate your referring to that article, because as Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, the editor of Foreign Affairs, will remember, it went through about 20 cycles of writing and revision, and Henry didn't like this, and back and forth. So the idea that somebody who was 100 years old was completely seized with this issue and thinking actively about it, that should be an inspiration enough. But to your point and framing it, I'd make 4 points very briefly. First, 78, 78, and 9. If you can identify the questions to which each of those is an answer, you'll have the big picture about in the international security scene today, the international security order, and a grounds for optimism. 78 years is how many years have passed since the last great power war. 78 years is also the number of years since nuclear weapons were used in war. And 9 is the number of nuclear weapon states. Each one of these, if you had made a bet about it in 1950, you would have got 1,000-to-1 odds against it. But these have been remarkable accomplishments and a testimony, I think, to both strategic imagination, statecraft, and stick-to-itiveness. And actually, Henry was part of this story, both in the thinking about it and the doing. So 78, 78, and 9. Secondly, and the article in the introduction explains more about that. Secondly, as the article notes, and recommends, beginning with initial conversations, starting with the two leaders, and then with trusted agents of them in a track 1 group, and then in track 2 groups, turned out in the case of nuclear weapons and the Cold War to be a very productive, surprisingly productive way for two deadly adversaries, nonetheless, to come to have a common vocabulary, to understand how each other saw the potentially existential danger, to find even arenas of common interest. So I would say, from looking at that history, what we had urged in that article was what actually happened at San Francisco as Xi and Biden began a serious conversation. And actually, I'm going off to China tomorrow to continue that effort. So point 3, a big takeaway from the nuclear story was the fact that two adversaries, each of whom was seriously determined to bury the other, could nonetheless find some islands of common interest. So while each would have liked to have been a nuclear monopolist, duopoly was a lot better than having many nuclear weapon states. And so they agreed on what ultimately became the non-proliferation regime and the 9 nuclear weapons. Each of them was clear that it would be a disaster if the other nuclear weapons were used accidentally or in an unauthorized fashion. So there was a shared interest in the central authority monopolizing control of the nuclear weapons. And ultimately, even as Joan, you remember, because you're familiar with this history, discussions of permissive action links or electronic locks or other ways of doing this. So I think from this story, I find, again, possibilities. Right now, as the article argues, there are 2 AI superpowers. They may find a common interest in not having AI, especially general AI, spread widely, and they have currently a near monopoly over the mass compute that's required even for training large language models. And then finally, obviously, as you pointed out in your framing, the differences between AI and nuclear are probably larger than the similarities. Certainly, this is not, and it would be a mistake to argue, this is just a second rerun of the movie we already saw. Nonetheless, the fact that for results that would have been given 1,000-to-1 odds, back again, I go to my 78, 78, 9, even longer odds, 75 years ago. In fact, we have managed somehow to survive and to deal with through human imagination, leaves me ultimately optimistic.
Well, I'm glad to hear the note of optimism again, Graham, but I want to press on that a little bit. And by the way, I do think it's important that we acknowledge that we've had 78 years of non-use of nuclear weapons. That is an absolutely extraordinary fact. And as Dr. Kissinger and his co-authors pointed out in the book they wrote, this is the book he co-authored with Eric Schmidt and Dan Huttenlocher, the fact that we have had nuclear non-use, we can't assume that that's going to continue indefinitely. In fact, to quote from, I have it here, to quote from his book, he says nuclear non-use is not an inherently permanent achievement. It is a condition that must be secured by each successive generation of leaders. And I think that's really important because I think many of us can argue we have taken our eye off the ball with respect to nuclear issues, and the hard-fought architecture that we built to safeguard ourselves and the world from nuclear use is being systematically dismantled. So we're in an extraordinarily dangerous period. But just to pick up on Graham's comment about the importance of the two AI superpowers engaging each other, Sam, I'd like to turn to you. What about that, right? How optimistic are you that that's feasible, and how do we go about safeguarding and regulating AI technology? Do you think it's conceivable that the two states will see that there's an existential common interest here, as opposed to a field for, yet another field for competition?
There's a fundamental question here, which is how do we coexist with a technology-enabled authoritarian power? We know that the Chinese government has used technologies like AI for all sorts of things that we are not comfortable with, from surveillance and tracking of dissidents, detention of Uyghurs, cyber-enabled weapons, right? The list goes on. And yet, we have to coexist. And actually, at Yale earlier this year, we had a delegation come in from China to talk about AI. And we were looking at the White House voluntary commitments around AI. And someone on the US side waved around the document and said, of these voluntary White House commitments, and they have to do with things like safety, transparency, broad use of weapons of mass destruction, what here would the Chinese government or Chinese companies not be willing to sign on to? And someone from the Chinese side said, we would sign on to that, except for the fact that it came from the White House. So if you strip out that, there's a lot of substance here. There's also some other and yets. The UK government, for example, last fall held the AI Safety Summit. And they recognized that if we are setting global norms and standards around AI, but we do not have China at the table, there are limits to how effective any of those norms and standards are going to be. There are also a host of reasons why losing connectivity with China in these emerging technologies is also dangerous from a national security perspective. We don't want to lose insight and visibility into what cutting edge work is happening in China, and the list goes on. So how do we do this? How do we action, to Graham's point, that Xi and Biden met in California and paved the way for a bilateral discussion on AI? What do we do? I have a couple of ideas just to sort of throw out there. OpenAI, for example, has begun to do some work on confidence building, which means hotlines, communication, sharing information about AI incidents, accidents, potentials for escalation, but confidence building measures that can be done without enhancing the capabilities of the other, without revealing underlying IP or model architecture. So that's something. And I think particularly in the area of AI safety, being able to do this will be important. In the military realm, the Chinese government has not officially endorsed maintaining human control over automated weapons. But I know from discussions with Chinese colleagues and experts that this is something that's very much top of mind. I think that there is space for private discussion, and in some of, for example, Graham, when you're in Beijing next week, what does human control mean? Does it just mean who touches the button at the end? Or does it mean the use of AI all along, from the intelligence analytics that go into that targeting package, for example? I think there's a lot of robust discussion that can happen there, and thinking about what is acceptable in the military realm. Now, are we ever going to roll back our export controls on advanced chips? Probably not. And so I think if the Chinese side goes into those discussions, hoping that as a starter, we're going to lift those export controls, they're dreaming. That's a fantasy. Is China going to stop using AI for surveillance and all matter of censorship? No. So I think if we can focus on some very concrete areas where we need to communicate, that's the way to do it. And it has to be done because this is a dangerous world if we cannot figure out how to coexist.
Thank you. If I could just follow that up with you, I'm wondering, because I know you've also done a lot of work on data and looking at Chinese accessing US data. And obviously, in addition to the hardware, the compute power, the algorithm data is a really big part of AI. How important is data to AI competition, and how's the US doing at protecting its data?
Sure. So data is one of the key inputs of AI, data and cloud, along with the computation and the talent. Oftentimes we hear the analogy, data is the new oil. I think that's been largely debunked. Data is not a zero-sum commodity. It's not a finite resource. I can have it, you can have it. It's in the combination and the aggregation of data that it's powerful, particularly as an input to AI systems. I think that China has a significant data disadvantage, in part because they rely on homogeneous data sets collected mostly from inside of China, but that's changing. It's the diversity of data, being able to access it from outside. And so this question of Chinese firms collecting data, US firms collecting data, not just in each other's countries, but increasingly around the world, is going to be a key one in terms of AI competition. How is the US doing? So earlier last month, the Biden administration unveiled a sweeping executive order, which for the first time will restrict data, Americans' data, from flowing to other countries. We've never done anything like this before. We now have a new legal regime set up that will be managed by the Department of Justice to limit countries of concern from accessing Americans' data. That rulemaking process is ongoing right now. Look, I think that it is addressing some very legitimate national security concerns. Access to data on the open commercial market is something that is, frankly, a wild west, and this is a new risk frontier. And it's really important to begin to understand to whom data is flowing, how is that big data being used and accessed. I think that there's some pros and cons to this particular executive action. Beginning to have a due diligence for data brokers. Data brokers are unregulated. Let's start regulating data brokers. This is a really important first step. The executive action also talks about putting in place stricter security requirements for certain kinds of data flows. So the use of privacy enhancing technologies. This is great. And if we can begin thinking about protecting the data, not just who it's going to, is going to be really important. I think there's going to be some limits to it. This action only affects data sales to foreign actors. So really, the US data broker market remains unregulated. And I think it's very, for a sophisticated cyber actor like China, if they just mask as a US purchaser, they can still access the data, right? So I think we're going to need to do some real thoughtful commenting on these rules to make sure that they're effective. But US policymakers are very much thinking about this question of who is accessing data, where is it flowing, because it is going to be so central to AI competition.
Yeah. Thank you. If we have time, I want to circle back on the data issue because I think there are some really important national security implications of it. It's such an important issue, but let's continue with kind of the framing of the challenge here. And Neil, I want to go to you next. You've written this wonderful biography of Dr. Kissinger, volume 1 of what I understand is going to be a 2-volume series. And the first volume is entitled The Idealist, which is counterintuitive to many people who didn't work with or know Dr. Kissinger well. And you identify how Dr. Kissinger's idealism informs his perspectives on questions of civilizational consequence, such as limited nuclear war and later in his life, nuclear disarmament. I'll just mention one example of that in the book that Dr. Kissinger co-authored with Eric Schmidt and Dan Huttenlocher, The Age of AI. There's a chapter on security, which I assume Dr. K had a pretty substantial hand in. And the author suggests that humans must be in the loop or in control of AI actions that have potentially lethal effects. And they go on to say that this is important because it, quote, ensures moral agency and accountability. And there are many such places throughout the book where there's an explicit link between our values, ethics, what's moral, as we think not only about AI, but also about various questions related to nuclear weapons. And that same chapter of The Age of AI ends with a statement that, quote, in the era of AI, the enduring quest for national advantage must be informed by an ethic of human preservation. So I'm wondering, Neil, how should we think about AI capabilities serving American values? We're mindful of it. At the same time, we're talking about how we safeguard this technology. There is this incredible drive to compete in this space. There are people saying that this should not be regulated at all. In fact, there's a whole kind of philosophical community that is emerging that calls themselves effective accelerationists. And they basically are arguing that we should be moving full speed ahead on the acceleration of technology, that it's this technology itself is going to lead to prosperity and security in the long run. So I guess the question is technical superiority sufficient for a durable American victory?
Clearly not, Joan. And here I'm going to try to channel how Dr. Kissinger thought about these issues. I think that's my role as his biographer at an event like this, which I'm very glad is happening, by the way. Not enough attention, I think, has been paid in the wider public to Dr. Kissinger's contribution in this particular area. I think one needs to begin to understand the young Kissinger, whom I think it was right to call an idealist, in Germany. Remember, the central problem of mid-20th century history is why the most technologically advanced country, which was Germany in the 1920s, produced the Third Reich, Hitler's dictatorship, and the Holocaust. And the perversion of science and technology by the Nazi regime is an extraordinary warning to all of us not to assume that technical superiority is sufficient. Friedrich Meinecke wrote brilliantly about this in The German Catastrophe. So I think Henry brought from his German youth a sense that new technologies could be used for ill as much as for good, and possibly more for ill. He wrote about nuclear weapons early in his career, publishing Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy in 1957. The argument of that book, that there should be limited nuclear war, at least as an option, to avoid the nightmare of total nuclear war. Going back to Graham's earlier point, thinking probabilistically in 1957, Dr. Kissinger, along with most experts, thought that Armageddon was quite likely, and you needed, therefore, to have some lower level limited nuclear war option if superpower conflicts weren't at some point inevitably to produce World War III. It's interesting that in the 1960s, he turned his attention briefly to the question of how computers would affect government. We don't think much about that because I don't think he ever published on it, but I found a wonderful paper on the subject asking, would in fact computerization make government less functional, not more functional? A pretty good question. And anybody who's interacted with the federal government recently will recognize that he was right to worry about that increasing complication and proliferation of bureaucracy as a result of computerization. So when he hit on the issue of artificial intelligence late in his life, not surprisingly, he asked from the outset, what are the downsides of this new technology? By the way, let's not forget how remarkable it was that he began publishing on this issue in 2018, at a time when very few people appreciated just what was about to be unleashed. ChatGPT didn't bring AI to wide public attention until, November 2022. Henry was ahead of the curve as so often in his life in writing about this. And what does he say in that first essay in The Atlantic? He says the problem about this is that we don't understand how AI arrives at its conclusions. Therefore, we're going to be plunged back into a pre-Enlightenment state of mystification. That's the central argument of his first contribution. The book that he later published, which we've already mentioned, co-authored with Eric Schmidt, was, I think, quite pessimistic on the issue of how AI could enable weapons systems. And by the way, it's all very well to say that there's going to be some kind of human switch in the process, but in reality, autonomous drone swarms won't have that. And that's already obvious from the way the war in Ukraine has evolved, that if you have drones that are piloted remotely, they can easily be disabled. So the future of drone warfare is autonomous mass with edge computing. There won't be any real way of controlling the drone swarms when they are enabled in that way. So I think this pessimism is warranted. And I'll say a little bit more about that before handing it back to you, Joan. Let's just remember what we did with fission. Ask yourself, after the discovery of the possibility of harnessing nuclear fission, which did we do more of? A, build warheads, B, build power stations. And the answer is, of course, A. We spent a great deal more energy, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, building nuclear weapons. We basically stopped building power stations out of an excessive risk aversion about nuclear energy. And I think that should really sober us when we think about how AI is likely to be used, especially under the present circumstances when it is being developed in an arms race between private companies. If nuclear fission had been developed in this way, then I think Graham's enormous success of 78 years would not have been achieved. Actually, we're developing artificial intelligence the way we developed crypto, not the way we developed nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, in a complete private sector free-for-all, where the arms race is not really between the US and China, it's between Microsoft, Google and Meta, the hyperscalers. And the notion that the executive order or anything else that government does is really restraining this race is a complete joke. I saw Mustafa Suleyman a couple of months ago, whose book, The Coming Wave, I highly recommend. And I asked him, isn't the real question how the big tech companies regulate the governments, not the other way around? And that's a reality I think we need to grasp. This thing is well out of the control of both the US and the Chinese governments. And I think that creates a very dangerous contingency, because as they hurtle towards the frontier of artificial general intelligence, the big tech companies have an insatiable appetite for electricity, for data centers, and of course for semiconductors. And what an irony that we have allowed the manufacture of the most sophisticated semiconductors, on which this entire process of AI development depends, to be concentrated in an island that is claimed by the People's Republic of China. What's fascinating to me is that both Henry Kissinger and Sam Altman agree that conflict is almost inevitable under these circumstances. The last thing I'll say is it's a little bit like Henry's still with us, because yesterday Eric Schmidt sent me a new book entitled Genesis, co-authored by Dr. Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Craig Mundie. So Henry hasn't stopped opining on this subject. I just had time to flick through it before this webinar, and sure enough, the conclusion warns that conflict is highly likely in the AI arms race. So to channel Dr. Kissinger, I think we should be pretty worried about where this is going, and a lot more concerned than maybe Graham is when he says we can manage this the way we managed nuclear arms control, or perhaps as confident as Sam is that we can find ways between the US and China to regulate it. I'm much more skeptical about both those claims.
All right, well, there's a dose of realism for us. Thank you, Neil, for providing a foil to some of the optimism we were trying to inject into this discussion. I want to come back to Graham to respond to some of that. And I do want to observe, I will just say, when the Center for AI Safety issued their statement last year saying AI should be a global priority, and then compared it to, as we do with pandemics and nuclear war, my reaction was, that's a really low bar, right? We've not done, while we have been very lucky to avoid a nuclear Armageddon over the last 78 years, as we're shredding the architecture that safeguarded us from nuclear weapons. It's not the best example to hold up. And by the way, we haven't been doing a great job at preventing the next pandemic either. These are both huge challenges. And Neil, thank you for pointing out just how challenging this moment is. Graham, I wonder if you could respond to some of what Neil just shared about the stark differences between AI and nuclear weapons, private sector versus governmental, who's regulating whom, and why even in that context, you're still, I think, optimistic. I don't know, can I say that? Maybe you can share with us, are you optimistic about our ability to get our arms around this technology in a way that protects humanity?
So thank you. So Neil and I have talked about this before, and I think we agree more than we disagree. So let me make sure I'm not misinterpreted as being sort of Pollyannish or unduly optimistic. I would say, as a betting matter, I would bet it turns out badly. Yeah, I was just making a bet. And with Henry, and I think Neil, I would agree. I would say that just what you said earlier, Joan, the 78, 78, and 9 is not meant to say we solved all those problems, put a bow around them and let's move on, which unfortunately is where most of the mind of most people is today, and of governments. But to say, what an incredible achievement. What an unbelievable achievement. How fragile. So as we write in that piece, each of these answers are not likely to be sustained for the next generation. And we had many very, very close calls. So again, pessimism is, I think, maybe a realism is the place to start. But I think the reason why I try to reach to that history for both some clues, but also for some inspiration, is that lo and behold, human beings did succeed for this long. I mean, basically for our entire lives, we've lived without what should normally have been the scourge for people. And that was as a result of lots of strategic imagination, lots of amazing statecraft, including Henry's that Neil has written about so brilliantly, and a lot of grace and good fortune. So I would say that there are clues and insights from this that are kind of like, these are the reasons for not giving up. This is not for sort of being comfortable about having a good outcome. And I think, Joan, as you pointed out, in the nuclear space, again, to take that for granted now, as most people do, and regard it as kind of, well, it's inconceivable. I try to do this with students. They say, great power war. There's never been a great power war that we can remember. So that must be obsolete. Or nuclear war, there hasn't been a nuclear war. So we're not going to worry about that. So I would say, again, across the spectrum, this is not a grounds for complacency, but I think it would be a mistake to be fatalistic about it, because if you had been fatalistic in 1945 or 50 or 55, as many people were, you might have just given up on it. And actually, a number of people thought, no, this is worth a try. This is possible. It's conceivable. There's Awesome. And I would say that story I find inspiring. Yeah.
So I wonder, we have just a few minutes left before we open up to questions from the audience. And I wonder, a question for each of you, are our governments taking this seriously enough, taking AI as a potential game-changing technology for humanity? Are we taking it seriously enough from the standpoint of our engagement with the private sector, our engagement at a government-to-government level? And I guess a philosophical question that goes with that in my own mind is, have we yet come to grips with what this technology potentially means, given that it is so widely distributed, that it's in the hands of the private sector, when we're living still in a Westphalian world, right? And our authorities and decision structures are still largely vested in governments that are becoming less and less functional to deal with the challenges of today's world. Are we just woefully behind in terms of innovation in the kind of governance mechanisms that we're going to need for the future? And Sam, I'm going to toss that question to you first.
I'll go back to your first question about the nature of the existential risk. And I said, no, it's not, if we don't let it. Mm-hmm. I think when we look back on this time in history, if we get this right, we will see that AI and related technologies will have profoundly positive impacts on humanity, from advancements in science and medicine, food, automation in the professional realm. But we must guard closely and be very careful about the military implications, AI-enabled cyber weapons. And if we can do this right, and I think this administration is in the process of grappling that, I think we can, and we will see that as a profoundly positive thing. But conversations like this that start from the basis of realism are fundamental to getting it right. And I think we need to be able to begin that right now, and recognizing also that we have a dysfunctional Congress. So if we, thinking about the Biden administration, the AI executive order dispatched a lot of work to dozens of agencies, recognizing if we get an AI law, that may not even be feasible, even if it's the best way to do it. So let's work with the tools we have across all of these industries.
Thank you. Neil, do you want to comment on the same question?
Well, I think the answer is that the governments are not serious, because if they were serious, the kind of conversations between Washington and Beijing that we've talked about would be happening with the utmost priority. Instead, they're not happening. And that's the tell. If you think about the role that Dr. Kissinger played in the strategic arms limitation talks, that consumed an immense amount of his time as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, for the very good reason that the arms race had kind of got out of hand in the 1960s, and the Soviets, by some measures, were overtaking the United States. Now, what's interesting about SALT is it's totally failed to stop the Soviets continuing to grow their arsenal. It just kept growing. And if that was the measure of success, SALT was a complete failure. But by engaging the Soviets in a serious, and it was undoubtedly serious, process of negotiation about strategic arsenals in all their complexity, I think SALT worked in a different way. It was the reality of détente, forcing the superpowers to negotiate, to engage with one another on a consistent basis. I think that significantly reduced the risk of, say, another Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1970s. We don't have anything like that happening between the United States and China right now, and we really need to. One of the last things that Dr. Kissinger said to me in the very last weeks of his life was, I think this negotiation, this arms control negotiation about AI will only happen when one side thinks it's losing the race. And he suspected that the reason that the Chinese were becoming more constructive, as he'd been in Beijing and discussed it with them, was precisely their fear that they were losing the AI race. But until we see those talks really happening at the highest level with the kind of people the kind of quality of people who did the SALT negotiations, I won't believe the governments are serious, because believe me, the United States government cannot do it on its own with executive orders, especially since executive orders could be completely torn up by January of next year if the Biden administration is defeated in the election.
Graham, any thoughts on that same question?
Well, I am, as you can tell, I'm a little schizophrenic, but I would say, on the one hand, I think Neil's reminder that the big difference between this and nuclear, the huge difference, is that this is being driven at warp speed by mega technology companies seeking fortune and dominance. And the idea that the government can keep up is sort of almost silly. It's just, it's got to be behind. So that's the pessimistic side of it. The more optimistic side, I would say, is, and maybe this is actually relevant for the audience. So this is, I think, again, analogous to the first decade after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in which time people had no idea what the hell was going on. I mean, basically, many of the people involved in making the bomb called for it to be abolished, as you pointed out. Oppenheimer became totally pessimistic about where things were going. Bertrand Russell was confident there was going to be a great nuclear war. So if you were taking odds at that time, most people saw Armageddon as the likely next phase. This is therefore, I would say, an opportunity for next generation strategic thinkers like Henry was at that stage to begin trying to get their head around what the hell is going on and can we conceptualize it. And so I would put in again a plug for, as Neil did, Mustafa Suleiman's book. If you haven't read The Coming Wave, I would say that's a pretty good place to start by somebody who's an AI frontiersman. He's got one of the LLMs of his own, Pi, but he's also been, for the last 5 years, as part of a conversation group that I'm part of, been trying to think his way around the question, are there any constraints that would be possible? And I think this is, again, early phase, but great opportunity for younger scholars looking for, a topic to chew on.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And there's so much there in all of these answers. We can circle back to some of this, but at this time, I would like to invite members and guests in New York and on Zoom to join our conversation with their questions. A reminder that this meeting is on the record. We will take our first question from here in New York. And the first hand I saw up was back of the room.
Hi, Miriam Saifi. Thank you so much for this panel. I'm a Foreign Service officer.
Can you please stand up? And yes, thank you for introducing yourself first.
Of course. Miriam Saifi, I'm a Foreign Service officer in a newly launched Bureau, Cyberspace and Digital Policy. So this panel is incredibly relevant. And we're trying in government to sort of keep up. I think what's interesting is the analogy with nuclear risk mitigation is just the velocity of change. Generative, as Neil mentioned, generative AI, the speed of this and the policy processes, it's sort of dizzying, to be honest. And so as we're thinking about Kissinger's legacy, how would he balance this need for maintaining our competitive advantage on the innovation space? We had this techno, capitalist laissez-faire approach that means we were having, the big tech companies all here, and we didn't regulate, but we need to, and we need guardrails. So how do you balance that need for guardrails so that we don't have this doomsday scenario, but we win the AI arms race?
Okay, who would like to, why don't we, Sam, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. Well, here again, I would say we have an opportunity to talk with our Chinese counterparts, believe it or not, because they are moving full steam ahead to regulate AI. And I don't think we would necessarily want to import and copy and paste everything that they're doing, but it's an opportunity to learn. So if you look at their generative AI regulation, for example, didn't know that it was written in Beijing, you might see some concepts that would be appealing to concerned members of civil society here worried about digital harms, for example. They talk about algorithmic harm and bias testing and evaluation. They also talk, of course, about making sure that AI is not going to be used to upset social stability and the ruling Communist Party and extremism. So it's a bit of the sweet and sour of all Chinese cyber regulation. But I think that that's one area that we can look at. We also have to think about with guardrails, right? What are the areas where there actually it may not make sense to work with Chinese researchers who are in military universities. But there are some when it comes to government or business communications, medicine, where we do need to work. And so in terms of the tools like export controls and investment reviews, I think that we should think closely about what is essential to the military versus what is just a commercial off-the-shelf technology or software that it can be that can be accessible from others, even if the US restricts it. Where is there a scarcity of knowledge that really does reside in the US? We don't want US components to be designed out in other parts of the world. And so there are a number of things we can do from the guardrails protect side. And then we just really have to lean into playing offense in ways that have nothing to do with China. But how can we think about creating the incentives for talent, for the use of an open capital markets, attracting the best and the brightest around the world? Where is there a role for public-private partnerships in a moment when industrial policy in the US is back in? And how do we think about allocating those resources wisely? Traditionally, governments have not been great at picking winners and losers. So now that we have the CHIPS and Science Act, for example, how can we make best use of those resources in a way that is not mimicking the Chinese system, but playing to our advantage of openness?
Well, thank you for putting some practical suggestions on the table. That's really helpful. Neil or Graham, do you want to add anything to the question?
Perhaps add something to the debate, again, applying history. In a way, it's worth looking back at the restrictions on chemical and biological weapons, which I think we don't think enough about. And in a way, they're more relevant here because an obvious worst case scenario for the abuse of AI is to use it to design biological or chemical, but probably biological weapons. And that's the kind of thing that one would want to have outlawed at the international level. I mean, of course, it's hard to hold totalitarian regimes to account when they subscribe to that kind of thing. And we can be pretty sure the Soviets didn't stick to the rules. But I think that there's an important argument to be made here that there needs to be some international convention that prohibits certain uses of AI. But I think if Dr. Kissinger were listening, he would say you need that, but you also need the superpower dialogue to be a meaningful dialogue about restraint, rather than two separate parallel conversations about how do we regulate AI in our national jurisdictions. That, I think, is a great waste of energy. And so I think it's very urgent, as I said earlier, but I'll repeat it, that there be meaningful AI arms control conversations between the US and the People's Republic of China, because that's surely one of the lessons of Dr. Kissinger's time in government, that can achieve maybe not restraint in terms of technological development, but it can build some trust, albeit trust with verification, between two superpowers, and that's what we urgently need.
Graham, anything to add?
I agree.
Very good. We don't have any questions from our virtual participants, so we'll take another question from the first table here in New York. Microphone is right behind you.
Winston Lord, greetings to my friends. I'm a friend of Henry Kissinger as well. Graham is going to China tomorrow to talk about these issues, and this most recent discussion sets up my question. I would like Graham to tell us what his talking points are, what he's going to say to the Chinese in terms of what priorities we ought to be looking toward. And then I'd like Neil and Sam to edit his talking points. Thank you.
Oh, wow, a real-time editing session. Graham, do you want to share your talking points?
Well, probably not altogether, but I'll say a couple of things. I think that this is part of I try to go to China at least a couple of times a year and talk to folks, both who are in Xi's team and who were in his team previously, whom I got to know fairly well because they became fascinated with Thucydides, whom they had never heard of. And the idea that there's a guy who was a contemporary of Confucius and that he had some big ideas has fascinated Xi Jinping and therefore the people around him. So I'm going to be mainly talking about talking to people about larger geopolitical issues. But consistent with Henry's conversations with Xi Jinping and the agenda that we recommended in that article, the proposition that the two leaders have now talked about this seriously. Xi Jinping is fascinated by AI. Henry talked to him at great length about it. And the fact that he and Biden had a serious conversation about it in San Francisco and authorized further track one conversations among trusted experts, that just needs to be happening now. So I would say that's something the US government wants to do, the Biden administration wants to do, but for whatever reason, the two governments have been slow to do it. I would say same thing with track 1.5 and track 2 equivalents, a number of which have already emerged. So I think, and if you look at the sort of things to discuss, I think all the comments here are very much relevant. So each of the two governments is struggling to deal with this problem for itself within its own borders. So therefore, simply explaining to each other better what each thinks it's doing and how much impact it's having and what difficulties it's having dealing with them and whether there are any clues and suggestions. Again, if you had been, Lynn, as you know better than anybody, if you had been outlining the talking points for the people in the early talks about arms control, the open sky agreement and whatever, they didn't have concrete, deliverables. They were beginning to try to see what's the area, what terms do people use for discussing it? What are the things about which they're most concerned? What actions are they taking to try to constrain? So China, being a autocratic, Xi party-driven state, is very concerned about rogue uses of AI that would be upsetting to the government stability and control. So that's an interesting question. Well, actually, I think the US government is also interested, as Neil said, in not having some AI company hook up with a CRISPR gene adapter to produce a biological weapon. So maybe there's some, so I would say this is much more exploratory, and I'm just, for that part of the agenda, trying to nudge it along.
Okay, Sam, any edits you would like to offer or
I want to just
reactions?
I think what would be helpful to emphasize is a point I made earlier, which is that the Chinese side has not officially committed to human control over AI in military domain. However, we've seen signals that they are concerned and thinking about this. Last summer at the UN, one of the senior representatives that they sent indicated his support for that principle. One of their working groups on ethics in Beijing has also signaled support for maintaining human control. So I think this could be a really important piece, Graham, to drill down on in your conversation, to understand what is the thinking behind this, what are some of the concerns, and to the point I made earlier, what does human control even mean? At what point in the chain are we talking about the data? Are we talking about the analytics, the targeting? What does that mean to the Chinese side? So I would really emphasize drilling down on this, even if we have not seen them willing to agree officially and publicly to that point yet.
Thanks, Sam. I think the human control question is a really important one. It's been, I think, simplified in the way many people talk about it in public in a way that is disconnected from the complexity of these systems. And Neil, as you pointed out, we already have drone swarms and we have technologies that have wired in different aspects of autonomous decision-making. And even if there is a human on the loop somewhere, it doesn't mean that we're really operating within a system where a human is in control. So I think that is a critical issue. Neil, did you want to make any observations about Graham's points?
Well, it's kind of presumptuous for any of us to talk to Winston Lord about this, considering his enormous contribution to US-China relations over the years. But see how you like this, Win. I think that the thing that I've learned from writing the second volume of the biography is the way that in détente a lot of things got interlinked, and linkage was a way to incentivize the Soviets to give ground on the things that the United States cared about. So my sense is that we need to do some linkage here to try to bring in issues that we know the Chinese really care about in order to get them to give ground on the things that we're worried about. So we should be very concerned about weaponization of AI, and we clearly need to get them to sign up to some restrictions. And we should remind them that we need some reassurance here, given all the concerns that arose in 2020 about what had been going on in laboratories in Wuhan and elsewhere. In fact, we all need to learn the lessons of COVID. The kind of research that was going on, gain of function research in virology, turned out to be incredibly dangerous. And I don't think we need to make that mistake again. So I think we need to have a conversation about how do we make sure that the Chinese are not weaponizing AI in ways that would be profoundly dangerous and unstable. What can we offer them in return? Hey, you know what? Those tariffs really aren't doing anybody any good, including in the US tech sector. We're going to have to do a whole lot of expansion of US electricity generation. Having tariffs on China when China produces some pretty useful transformers is just stupid. And the US should be moving away. This should be on the agenda of any second Biden administration, away from the tariffs, because I think they're in fact of very limited use in this area. I think the Chinese would welcome that, and it wouldn't cost us. Indeed, I think it would benefit us to ease those tariffs. And finally, Taiwan. Let's not forget that, as I mentioned earlier, having all the most sophisticated semiconductors virtually being manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan creates a unique strategic vulnerability and a huge economic risk to the world. I think in the last 4 years, the US has said things about Taiwan, even if it's sometimes walked them back, that have not been sensible, that have aroused Beijing's anxiety on this issue precisely at the time when the US can't really deter China from taking action against Taiwan in the way that we could deter it in the mid-1990s. So I think a restatement of the status quo before people started to question strategic ambiguity would be very sensible. Of course, it's been done in some measure already, but I think constantly reassuring them on that issue would be another way to promote engagement and rebuild trust between the two capitals. So those would be my suggestions for a quite broad agenda designed to get meaningful concessions from Beijing on the things we really worry about.
Thank you. Sam, you've got a two-finger, and then we're going to go online.
I just wanted to respond to the point about tariffs. Neil, how would you reply to the Chinese who said, well, we will engage in the conversation that you want us to about restraint, but you need to lift export controls on advanced chips? I think once we get into holding a conversation about restraint, which is the existential risk that you've pointed out, once we hold that hostage to a suite of other carrots and sticks, we're not going to be in a position where we're willing to walk away from export controls in order to have that restraint conversation. So how would you respond to the Chinese then?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is until we have really good understandings on AI and its use and abuse, we're very prudent to have export restrictions, just as we restricted the export of technology to the Soviet Union. You know,
no,
right
exactly.
now
we need to keep them in place, but we can't hold a conversation about restraint hostage to that, is I think the point. We don't want to get a negotiation.
You need to. I think tariffs and export restrictions are quite different things, and in my view, the tariffs are kind of a white elephant at this point for American policy. If anything, they somewhat impede our efforts. Our industrial policy would be well served by a trade liberalization agreement with China, but obviously it's trade liberalization on things that are not strategically crucial in the AI arms race. I think that's possible. That's the kind of distinction that détente negotiations are all about. And of course, everybody ends up feeling a bit grumpy, but that's I think that's the crux of this matter, to make it concrete that we can't have laboratories, whether in Wuhan or anywhere else, conducting experiments with AI-enabled weapons. That's what we need to absolutely rule out. And remember, dealing with the CCP means that we have to be very wary that they might sign agreements and yet welch on them in the way that the Soviets did. So this is why the trust and verify piece will be very important in any kind of regime of AI arms control.
Okay, there's so much there, but we're going to go to an online question.
We will take the next question from Paula Stern. Please accept the unmute now prompt.
Thank you for this discussion. I'd like to go back to a point that has not gone deep enough, I think, in this afternoon's discussion. And it is that the technology we're discussing is more in the hands of the private sector. Unlike the period in which Kissinger reigned, the military-industrial complex really was in the hands of the military, of the government. Today, we have a situation in which AI is very much not in the hands of the government unless we act. And it kind of goes back to Sam's first answer. AI is not a problem if we, but it's what we do with it. And so I'd like the three of y'all to perhaps give some hope or suggestions of how our diplomats really do rein in this technology in such a way that it reflects the United States national interests.
Sam, let's start with you.
Thank you, Paula. I think there's two separate issues. One is, how do we regulate domestically, given that this is in the hands of private entities, and how do we think about government-private sector interactions in that realm? But I want to answer it in terms of how do we think about diplomacy with the Chinese. My understanding is that Kissinger, one of his extraordinary legacies, has been a dialogue with Chinese counterparts on AI, and that it includes many of these most senior executives from the private sector, from both the Chinese and the US side. And I think this is really critical that we have these senior private sector stakeholders in the room conducting that diplomacy. There's a bit of an allergy right now in Washington to engaging too much with the private sector because it's seen as lobbying. And yes, lobbying is real and we have to be aware of that. But the reality is, to Paula's point, and on many of these technologies, a lot of the expertise resides in the private sector. And so they have to be at the table when we engage with China on this.
Thank you. Graham, do you want to add your thoughts?
I certainly second Paula's proposition that is a fundamental feature of the current challenge from AI is that it is driven by private companies and private researchers seeking private advantage. And that's it's a fiercer rivalry actually among the big tech companies than I think we've ever seen between two countries. So, Google regards it as almost existential for Google if Microsoft eats its search engine, from which it gets about half of its profits. And you can see that, therefore, this is something in which, totally unlike the nuclear space, as Paula rightly points out, it was controlled by the government. So I would say you have to start with the fundamentals as they are. But again, I don't want to repeat all the things I said before. I think starting from those fundamentals, there's still space for a creative statecraft.
Neil, what's your take on how do we flip the script so that it's not the private sector regulating government, but the other way around?
Well, I like this question. We should remember that the federal government of our time is not the federal government of the 1940s. And it would be hard to think of any surer way to impede the advance of artificial intelligence than to empower some federal regulator to get in the way. Here, I want to remind everybody that the business of America is business, that the reason the United States is ahead of China in the AI race is precisely that the innovation has been driven by private corporations in a market economy rather than by state-led or state-owned institutions in a one-party state. So let's not forget that this is actually the superpower. We've attracted capital to the United States and talent to the United States. Incredible amounts of foreign talent have come here precisely because we have the rule of law and a free market economy. That's why the US is ahead. But we must also remind the people at the big tech companies that their counterparts 100 years ago, the great arms manufacturers, the innovators in the technologies of the mid-20th century, when the crunch came, knew that they had to subordinate their private interests to the national interests. And I think that's the key feature of American power in the 20th century, the way in which the private sector would, in time of crisis, accept without real questioning the leadership of the federal government. It's actually the most impressive thing about the US economy in World War II, how that works, with the executives from major corporations effectively working for free to ensure that the huge capacity of the American private sector could serve the national interest. So I think we have a playbook for this, but I'm not sure that we've dusted it down and looked very hard at it. One reason that Graham Allison and I have been arguing for applied history as a tool of policy for much of the last 10 years is that we see little sign that today's policymakers are aware of these precedents. They don't have, I think, a very good playbook for working with the leaders of the big tech companies in time of crisis. We need to rehearse this, because if there's one thing we learned in 2020, we did not have a preparedness plan for a pandemic that worked. We had one, but it didn't work. And it didn't work because we didn't really test it or think much about it. We need much, much better playbooks for the kind of national emergency that I can readily imagine, and certainly Dr. Kissinger could readily imagine. And at this point, I don't see much sign that it exists.
Okay, we are nearing the end of our time here. We might have time for one more question, but we wouldn't have time for the answers to the question. What I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists to just offer maybe one thought or one recommendation, one takeaway from this session today. And you could answer either in terms of whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to actually safeguard this technology, or perhaps give us your number one recommendation for leaders, given where we are at this moment in time.
Go to
Sam?
them. Please go to them first.
Okay, Graham, this is top of mind for you because you've prepared for a trip to Beijing.
Again, just to repeat, I would say, remember 78, 78, and 9. This is an unbelievable accomplishment. It's not a finished product. It's a work in progress. It's at risk. It's vulnerable even in itself, but it does give, I think, some basis for hope that human beings, if they apply their strategic imagination and engage in serious statecraft and learn the lessons of history, can be successful. So I would say, again, if you look at human history, it goes back and forth between despair and hope, but I still am hopeful.
Thank you, Graham. I like the sense of optimism there. Neil?
Well, I'm sorry, Graham, I'm just going to rain on the parade a little with a quotation from Dr. Kissinger's final book, co-authored with Eric Schmidt and Craig Mundy. Quote, "As AI accelerates the timeline of evolution beyond comprehension, humanity will become divided into warring factions. Policymakers need to keep in mind that history makes that kind of outcome pretty likely. And I think we need to approach all of these issues not in a spirit of, hey, we survived Cold War One, we'll be fine, but rather than a spirit of, we got really lucky in Cold War One, we might not be so lucky in Cold War Two. And it was Henry Kissinger's view that the second Cold War would be more dangerous than the first. Here I'm quoting him again, because of the technology. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Neil, Sam.
I would urge policymakers to approach these issues with humility and recognition that we can't take for granted what's come before, but also that America's power and role in the world may be shifting and technologies play a role in that. So humility to start.
So that's an excellent wrap up. Thank you for joining this session, and big thanks to our three panelists. This has been, I think, a fascinating and important discussion. Please note that the video and transcript of this symposium will be posted on CFR's website. And with that, we conclude. Thank you very much.